Hello, I'm John Gravino. I'm the author of The Moral Landscape of the New Atheism. Welcome to another edition of the New Walden Book Club. We've been talking about the new Eric Metaxas book. It's called If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. In our last episode, we discussed the introduction, and today our focus is Chapter 1. It's called The Idea of America, and Metaxas tells us that that idea is liberty. This was what made America unique, whereas most countries are defined by language and culture. America is defined by this idea of universal liberty. But liberty poses a problem for government. For the very business of government is to enforce laws, and laws by their very nature impose limits on human freedom. And so the question raised by Metaxas is whether any form of government is compatible with the ideal of human freedom. On page 27, Metaxas talks about the necessity of government, and I want to share that with you. He says, "Let's remind ourselves that any reasonably good government, including a monarchy, is far better than no government, infinitely so. To have no government at all simply means anarchy, and where there is anarchy, the strong will soon oppress the weak, usually cruelly. Anyone who has seen human beings brutalized by other human beings knows that there is an important role for government. On the simplest level, government exists to protect innocent people, both from within, from those who would steal and rape and murder, and from without, from foreign powers that would do the same on a wider scale. In order to deal with the passions of fallen human beings, some government is therefore necessary." And then skipping over to page 29, here was the conundrum. Though people needed some kind of government to keep them from killing one another or stealing from one another or brutally subjugating one another, government was often no more than the strongest warrior or group of warriors taking over and imposing their will. Often they had risen to govern in the most violent fashion and governed that way as well. They did not so much govern as rule. So the question is there a compromise? Is there a way to balance the obvious need for government to keep peace and order in society? And is there a way to do that and still make room for the ideal of human liberty? Metaxas tells us that the founders of our country found the solution to this problem in the Bible, specifically in their biblical view of human nature. And the first principle of this theory of human nature is that man suffers from a fallen, corrupt human nature, and this corruption is characterized, its defining characteristic is selfishness. In the letter of James chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, we read about the consequences of this selfish human nature. Here's what it says. "What causes wars and what causes fightings among you? Is it not your passions that are at war in your members? You desire and do not have, so you kill. And you covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and wage war." This passage from James describes how human selfishness destroys universal liberty. We are born into an environment of scarcity, and so naturally there arises a competition for the goods of society. Now, how does this competition play itself out? Are human beings generous and fair-minded? Do they look out for their neighbors? Or are they selfish? Are they looking out for number one? Well, human nature guarantees, pretty much, that it's not a competition that is characterized by justice and fair play. It's a might makes right competition, and the typical result is that the winner takes all. The victor oppresses the vanquished, the stronger enslaves the weaker, and the inalienable rights to liberty are trampled underfoot. This is no description of democracy, but anarchy. Not civilization, but the jungle. The founders' answer to this selfishness was to institute divided government, what we know to be our system of checks and balances. Because of our selfish human nature, rulers cannot be trusted to pursue or to safeguard the common good. Rather, they're more likely to pursue their own self-interest. And so the founders thought it wise to divide the powers of government among different branches. It's a system that has worked quite well, not perfectly, but nevertheless, most people would agree that on the curve, if you were grading on the curve, the system of checks and balances has worked quite well. So the system of divided government, checks and balances, does a very good job of preventing the government from trampling on human freedom. But government isn't the only threat to our human freedom. The citizens themselves can be a threat to each other's freedoms. What's to prevent one group of people from enslaving another group of citizens? The founders, once again, found the solution to this problem in the Bible's view of human nature, in a second principle of that theory of human nature. The second principle that you can find in the Bible is that while it's true that human beings are selfish by nature, they are nevertheless, the selfishness is not a permanent feature of the human personality. The human personality is dynamic. It is capable of transcending its selfishness, and through hard work, and also through grace. Now, the more we are transformed, the less selfish we are, the more generous we are. And the more generous we are, the more likely we are to think about our neighbor, to think about their interests, and this serves to reduce the threat of conflict in society. And with a more generous citizenry, you can expect fewer conflicts, and then there's less of a need for government to step in and to impose law and order through force. Because when government does that, human beings once again lose their freedom. So, the upshot of all of this is that virtuous and generous citizens enjoy more freedom because they don't need government to maintain peace and order. But selfish citizens suffer from at least two threats to their freedom. A selfish citizenry has to worry about other selfish citizens taking away their freedom, but they also have to worry about government taking away the freedom just in order for them to do their jobs. If government is constantly struggling with rioting, looting bands of citizens, it'll be necessary in that case to take away human freedom just to impose law and order. So, the conclusion of all this: generous citizens enjoy more freedom. Selfish citizens suffer necessarily from a loss of human freedom. Metaxas tells us that we've forgotten this biblical view of human nature. And the blame for this, he spreads around quite evenly. It's not one group that is more guilty of this than another. He blames both conservatives and liberals for forgetting about this view of human nature. I'm going to start with what he says about conservatives. He specifically identifies neoconservatives, and he talks about their faith in unregulated financial markets. And I think his point is a very good one. Look, if government cannot be trusted, why can financial markets be trusted? In the same way that government is not going to safeguard the common good, neither are unregulated markets. And so if a system of checks and balances is necessary for government, a system of checks and balances is going to be necessary for our financial markets and every other sector of society, for that matter. I think that's a very good point. And then he also talks about liberal errors with respect to human freedom. And his comments there focus primarily on the sexual revolution. And his comments, I want to read to you what he has to say about that on page 39. He's describing here on page 39 a television interview with a liberal pundit. Here's how he characterizes that discussion. She seemed to think that American freedom was principally about having no sexual limits, about throwing off all oppression, and most important, sexual oppression or repression. It was a classically Freudian idea of the problem at the center of human life, and as far as she was concerned, that was what our American freedom existed to wipe out. Okay, so that's basically my summary of Chapter 1, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move into the commentary section of our discussion, and I want to stay with this idea that I want to stay with Metaxas' thoughts on the sexual revolution. He says in the quote I just read that liberals accept the Freudian analysis of the human condition. Metaxas is on the money here, and here's why that's important. Freud's theories diametrically contradict the biblical view of human nature, which is the very foundation of our democracy, as Metaxas has been telling us all throughout Chapter 1. Specifically, Freud rejected the biblical idea that human nature could be transformed, that it could transcend its selfishness. But the Bible teaches that essential to this transformation was the practice of self-denial, asceticism. It is a message that is all throughout the New Testament. It's the doctrine of the cross of Jesus Christ, and it is all throughout the epistles. Thus, the key to overcoming our selfishness, according to the Bible, was in saying no to our selfish desires. And because selfishness is the root cause of injustice, conflict, and oppression, the key to peace and freedom in a self-governing democracy is the practice of self-denial. But Freud rejected this analysis. Self-denial does not cultivate virtue and generosity, and does not lead to a peaceful, self-governing democracy. No, self-denial leads instead to mental illness, according to Freud. These Freudian ideas have won the day, make no mistake about that, and as a result, the West has rejected the biblical prescription of self-denial. But was this a smart idea? That's the question Metaxas is raising in Chapter 1. And the answer to that question depends on who was right about human nature. If Freud was right, then our overindulgent consumer society should be enjoying a supreme mental health. True, the liberation of our desires has made us bankrupt, obese, and given us an epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases. But this is the price one pays for our brave new Freudian world. Unfortunately, however, this therapeutic revolution has not produced improvements in mental health either, and I get into the details of this in my own book. Mental health has in fact gotten worse. A recent report by the CDC that just came out in April reported that from 1999 to 2014, the suicide rate in our country rose 24% for all age groups, and both male and female. And there's an important statistic to remember about suicide. Research has shown that in 90% of all suicides, the victim had been previously diagnosed with a mental illness, meaning that the suicide rate for a population is a pretty good indicator of that population's mental health. This alarming rise in mental illness should tip us off that Freud was wrong to reject the Christian view of human nature, which means that it was a bad idea to take his advice. The liberation of our desires, with all the hedonism and hyperconsumption, has made us fat, broke, and infected with sexual diseases. And we are not psychologically healthier either, as I show in my book. In fact, what I show in my book is that the liberation of our desires has made us more mentally ill. Lots of research links hyperconsumption to all the major forms of mental illness. And a lot of this can be explained by the impact of our hyperconsumption on the dopamine reward system of the brain. Lots of evidence suggests that it was a huge mistake to follow Freud. And further, if the biblical theory of human nature was correct all along, then the rejection of self-denial has in fact reinforced our fallen nature and made us more selfish. If in fact we have become more selfish, then we can expect more intolerance, more conflict in society, more violence, more social disruption. And if the Bible was right all along, then we should expect this intolerance to come from those who most completely rejected the ascetical wisdom of the Bible, from those liberal and secular opponents of Christianity. In a recent interview, whom did liberal commentator Don Lemon say was the most intolerant group? Liberals. And was it not on display at their convention? You bet. They even shouted down their own candidate for president. Metaxas has raised a most provocative question. Can democracy survive the sexual revolution? We'll return to this important question in our next discussion of the new book by Eric Metaxas, If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty. I hope you'll join us for this important discussion.